In September of 1962, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Grundy Center, Iowa, a 31-year-old woman named Ruth Hadley paid $40 for a 1948 Oliver 88 that had not moved under its own power in 11 years. The front axle had settled into the soil so completely that the grass had grown up through the wheel spokes and dried there, stiff and brown, like something the tractor had tried to hold on to. The hood was gone entirely, not rusted off. Gone. Removed for reasons nobody at the sale could explain, and nobody had bothered to ask. The engine bay was open to the sky and had been for long enough that a pair of starlings had nested in the valley between the block and the firewall, and the nest was still there, dry and compact, woven from field grass and baling twine. The rear tires held air in the technical sense that they were not completely flat, but both showed sidewall cracking deep enough to catch a thumbnail. The hydraulic lines had been cut, not disconnected cut, at some point, and the ends had oxidized to a color somewhere between copper and rust that suggested the cutting had happened in the Truman administration. The steering wheel was cracked across the hub. The seat pan had rusted through in one corner. The auctioneer listed it between a set of harrow teeth and a pile of fence posts, and he did it the way a man reads a legal notice he is required by law to read but does not personally endorse. 1948, Oliver 88, he said. Runs, well, it has not run recently. Sells as is. Who'll start me at 50? Nobody started him at 50. He came down to 40, and Ruth Hadley raised her hand, and the auctioneer took her money with an expression of mild relief, as though he had expected to have to haul the thing to the county road himself. The scrap dealer who had come to the sale specifically for the Oliver had dropped out at 35. He told the man standing next to him that he couldn't make the numbers work even at scrap weight, which was the most honest assessment anyone at that sale offered all day. Ruth's brother-in-law, Dale Pfeiffer, had driven her to the sale in his truck because she didn't have a trailer yet. He watched her hand the auctioneer 4 $10 bills, and he waited until they were walking back toward the truck before he said anything. "Ruth," he said, "what in the world are you going to do with that?" She told him she had a plan. He nodded the way a man nods when he has decided the conversation is not going to go anywhere useful, and he went to find someone with a tractor to drag the Oliver onto his flatbed. The story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties. It left the Grundy County Fairgrounds that afternoon and reached the feed store in Grundy Center by the following morning, and by the time it reached the co-op, it had acquired the detail that Ruth had paid $60 instead of $40, and by the time it reached the diner on the east side of town, it had acquired the further detail that the tractor had been underwater at some point, which was not true, but was the kind of thing that made the story better. By Sunday, it had reached the church parking lot, and the men who discussed it there were not cruel about it exactly, but they were certain. They were certain the way men are certain when they have looked at a situation and applied the full weight of their collective experience and arrived at a conclusion that feels like common sense. The conclusion was that Ruth Hadley had made a $40 mistake, and that the Oliver 88 rusting in her equipment shed was going to sit there until it became part of the shed, and that this was a shame because Ruth was a hard worker, and the farm was a good piece of ground, and she deserved better than to spend her money on junk. Let me tell you about Ruth Hadley, because what she did with that Oliver only makes sense if you understand who she was. Ruth Elaine Hadley was born in 1931 on the same 240 acres outside of Grundy Center that her father, Vernon Hadley, had bought in 1924 for $38 an acre and paid off in 11 years by farming it and by doing machine work for every neighbor within 20 miles who needed something fixed and couldn't afford to buy a new one. Vernon Hadley was not a machinist by training. He was a farmer who had understood from an early age that the difference between a farmer who survived hard years and a farmer who didn't was almost never the quality of his land. It was whether he could fix what broke without writing a check he couldn't cover. He had taught himself on a lathe he bought second-hand from a closed machine shop in Waterloo in 1928 for $40 and hauled home in pieces in the back of a borrowed truck. He had set it up in the shop behind the house, a concrete floor building with a wood stove in the corner and a tin roof that amplified the rain so completely that you had to stop talking when a storm came through, and he had been using it ever since. By the time Ruth was old enough to be useful in the shop, Vernon had added a drill press, a bench grinder, a full set of taps and dies, and a parts washer he had fabricated himself from a salvaged tank and a kerosene burner. The tools were arranged on pegboard he had built himself, each tool outlined in paint, so that the empty space told you immediately what was missing. He had started that system in 1935 and maintained it without interruption for the rest of his life, which meant that when Ruth walked into the shop as a child, she was walking into a system of thinking as much as a collection of tools. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was there because it had been left there. Vernon taught Ruth to use the lathe when she was 12, not to watch him use it, not to hand him tools while he used it, to use it. He taught her to read a micrometer before she could drive. He taught her that a part made to the right tolerance the first time cost nothing, and a part made wrong cost you the time to make it again, plus the time you'd already spent, and that this arithmetic applied to everything in life, not just machining. He was not a man who made speeches. He delivered this philosophy in short sentences while he was doing other things, and Ruth absorbed it, the way children absorb the beliefs of parents who live what they believe rather than announce it. Ruth was a good student in the way that bright children raised on farms are good students, efficient, practical, impatient with abstraction that didn't connect to anything real. She had a scholarship offer from Iowa State in 1949. She had a suitcase half-packed for 3 weeks that summer while she thought about it. In the end, she didn't go, and the reason she gave people was that her father needed her on the farm, which was true, and the reason she didn't give people was that she had looked at what 4 years away would cost against what 4 years at home would build, and the arithmetic had come out clearly on one side. This was not a sacrifice, it was a calculation, and Ruth Hadley trusted her calculations. Vernon's health began to decline in 1955. Ruth had been running the day-to-day operation of the farm for 2 years before that, and she assumed the rest of it without ceremony. Vernon died in the spring of 1959, and he left Ruth a paid-for farm with no mortgage, no equipment loans, and no partners. He left her the shop with every tool in its outline space on the pegboard. He left her a savings account at the Grundy County Bank with $11,400 in it, accumulated over 30 years of never spending money he didn't have and never borrowing money he didn't need. He left her, in other words, everything that mattered. Ruth was 28 years old when she buried him, and she was 31 when she bought the Oliver. And in the 3 years between those events, she had added to the savings account steadily and reduced it by exactly nothing. Now, the Oliver. When Ruth Hadley looked at that 1948 Oliver 88 sitting in the corner of the Grundy County Fairgrounds, with grass growing through its wheel spokes and a starling nest in its engine bay, she did not see what everyone else saw. Here is what everyone else saw. A machine that hadn't run in 11 years. Missing hood, cut hydraulic lines, cracked tires, rusted seat. $40 worth of iron at best, and the scrap dealer had already told you it wasn't worth $40 at scrap weight. Here is what Ruth saw. She saw the 231 cubic inch overhead valve 6-cylinder engine that Oliver had put in the 88, an engine that, if the block was sound, could be rebuilt for a fraction of what a new tractor cost. She saw the transmission, which on the Oliver 88 was a 6-speed unit that was, by 1962, understood by every mechanic in the county who had worked on one to be nearly indestructible if it had been kept reasonably lubricated, which this one had been, because the previous owner had apparently maintained the drivetrain, even when he stopped maintaining everything else. She saw the rear axle and the PTO and the 3-point hitch geometry, all of which were standard enough to accept implements she already owned or could acquire cheaply. But here is the part nobody at the auction knew. Ruth had not decided to buy an Oliver 88 at the Grundy County Fairgrounds in September of 1962. She had decided to buy an Oliver 88 in February of 1962, 7 months earlier, when she had driven to a farm sale in Tama County and purchased for $60 a Continental F244 engine out of a scrapped skid loader. She had driven it home in the back of her truck, covered with a tarp, and she had put it in the shop and spent 3 evenings measuring it and making notes on graph paper and confirming what she had suspected when she first read the specifications in a machinery manual she had borrowed from the county extension office. The Continental F244 was a 244 cubic inch 4-cylinder engine. It was not the engine Oliver had put in the 88, but it shared within tolerances Ruth had verified with her father's micrometer, a bell housing bolt pattern that could be made to mate with the Oliver 88's transmission, with a fabricated adapter plate. The F244 produced more torque at lower RPM than the Oliver's original 6. It was simpler. It had fewer parts. Replacement components were available from industrial suppliers at prices that bore no relationship to the agricultural parts market. And Ruth had already bought one for $60. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. They were watching execution. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Ruth Hadley proved that what her father had taught her was not sentiment. It was a method. She started in October of 1962 after the harvest was in, working evenings and weekend mornings in Vernon's shop, with the wood stove running and the single overhead bulb casting, the kind of light that makes every shadow precise. She began with the Oliver's frame and running gear, which she assessed component by component over the first 2 weeks. The frame was straight. The rear axle was sound. The transmission, when she drained it, produced fluid that was dark but not metallic, which told her what she needed to know. The front axle needed new kingpins. The steering box needed to be disassembled and shimmed. These were not surprises. She had budgeted for them. The original Oliver engine came out in pieces over 3 evenings. Ruth pulled the head and found 2 cracked cylinders, which confirmed what she had already planned for. The block went to the scrap pile. The head went with it. She had not paid for the Oliver's engine. She had paid for everything around it. The Continental F244 came off the shop floor and onto the engine stand. Ruth had rebuilt it over the summer, working from a service manual she had ordered from a supplier in Des Moines, replacing the rings, the bearings, the valve seals, and the water pump with parts she had sourced from an industrial supplier in Cedar Rapids that sold to construction equipment operators and charged accordingly less than the agricultural parts. Dealers charged farmers for equivalent components. The engine rebuild parts had cost her $67. The engine itself had cost $60. She had a rebuilt, tested engine for $127. The adapter plate was the critical piece, and it was the piece that required Vernon's lathe. Ruth had drawn it on graph paper in February, revised it twice after measuring the actual bell housing and the actual engine flange, and cut the steel from a piece of plate she had bought from a steel supplier in Waterloo for $11. She machined it over 4 evenings, checking the fit against both mating surfaces after every significant cut, and when she bolted it up the first time it seated, flush with no gaps and no stress. She had made the part to the right tolerance the first time. Her father would have nodded once and moved on. The transmission bearings and seals cost $46 from a bearing supplier in Iowa City. The clutch discs cost $28. The hydraulic system required a complete seal kit at $8 and new lines. She bent herself from bulk tubing at a cost she folded into the hardware total. The front axle kingpins and bushings cost $22. The steering box shims she made herself from shim stock that cost less than $1. New front tires were $30 for the pair, bought from a farm sale in Butler County, where a widow was liquidating equipment her sons had no use for. The rear tires she had repaired with a vulcanizing kit she already owned. Oliver 88 frame and running gear, $40. Continental F244 engine from skid loader, $60. Engine rebuild parts, $67. Transmission bearings and seals, $46. Clutch discs, $28. Hydraulic seal kit, $8. Adapter plate steel, $11. New front tires, $30. Fuel, electrical components, and hardware, $31. Miscellaneous, $19. Total, $340. She found a hood from a wrecked Oliver 88 at a junkyard in Marshalltown for $20, which brought the final total to $360. She painted the tractor in Vernon's shop, using a brush and a quart of Oliver green she had mixed herself from a paint supplier's base, and the finish was not what a dealership would have produced. But it was even, and it adhered, and Ruth Hadley had not built this tractor to impress a dealership. The Oliver turned over for the first time on a Saturday morning in March of 1963. Ruth had connected the battery, primed the fuel system, set the choke, and turned the key. The Continental turned over twice, coughed once, and caught. The engine settled into an idle that was deeper and steadier than any Oliver 88 had produced from the factory, because this was not a factory engine. It was a rebuilt engine set to tighter tolerances than a production line allowed, and it idled with the authority of a machine that had been assembled by someone who knew exactly what each clearance meant. The exhaust note was different fuller, heavier, the sound of 244 cubic inches breathing through a pipe designed for 231. Ruth let it idle for 20 minutes, watching the temperature gauge and the oil pressure gauge and listening. Then she shut it off, checked for leaks, found none, and went inside to make breakfast. She did not call anyone. She did not drive it to the road and let people see it. She finished the remaining adjustments over the following week and put it to work on her own ground in April when the soil dried enough to plant. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone so completely, and for so long that the underestimating became its own kind of fact, stick with me. Because this is where the story stops being about a tractor and starts being about something else entirely. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. The first person outside of Ruth's farm to see the rebuilt Oliver working was her neighbor to the north, Harold Bramer, who farmed 320 acres and had watched Ruth's operation with the particular attention of a man who had decided he already understood what he was watching. Harold came to the fence line in May of 1963 because he had heard an engine note he didn't recognize, and he wanted to know what it was. He stood at the fence and watched Ruth pull a 4-bottom plow through ground that he knew, from farming adjacent to it for 20 years, was heavy clay that ran hard in dry springs. His own Oliver 88, a newer one, a 1955, bought from the dealer in Grundy Center for a price that had required a 5-year loan, pulled 3 bottoms in that ground on a good day. He watched Ruth's tractor pull 4 without laboring. Harold Bremer was a fair man. He took his cap off and rubbed the back of his neck and waited for Ruth to come around on the headland. When she did, he flagged her down. He asked her what she had done to the engine. She told him she had replaced it with a Continental F244 on a fabricated adapter plate. He asked her where she had gotten the engine. She told him. He looked at the tractor for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Vernon would have liked that." Ruth said she thought so too, and she put the tractor back in gear and went back to work. Harold Bremer told 2 farmers at the co-op what he had seen. Not the story that had traveled from the fairgrounds to the feed store to the diner. A different story. The story of farmers telling other farmers something they had seen with their own eyes. The laughter did not stop immediately, but it changed in quality, the way a sound changes when the room it's traveling through changes shape. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 15 years, because this is where the story stops being about a tractor and starts being about the arithmetic of independence. Ruth farmed her 240 acres through the 1960s with the rebuilt Oliver as her primary tractor. She bought a second tractor in 1966, a 1952 Minneapolis Moline she acquired at an estate sale for $85 and rebuilt in Vernon's shop over the winter, and the rebuild cost her $210. And the combination of the 2 machines gave her the equipment capacity to farm her ground without hiring custom operators, which saved her approximately $400 a year at the rates then prevailing. She kept her books in a ledger she had started the year her father died, entering every expenditure and every receipt in the same hand, and the ledger told her every year what the farm cost and what it returned and where the difference went. Not because she enjoyed bookkeeping, because the ledger told her the truth about her operation, and Ruth Hadley preferred truth to comfort. By 1970, she had added a 3rd rebuilt tractor and a grain dryer. she had assembled from salvaged components. By 1973, when commodity prices spiked and every farmer in Grundy County was borrowing against projected income to expand, Ruth Hadley looked at the ledger and looked at the loan rates and made a decision that her neighbors found baffling. She did not expand. She did not borrow. She bought a used grain bin for cash and increased her storage capacity, which meant she could sell into the market on her own schedule rather than at harvest when prices were lowest. And she put the difference in the bank. The savings account her father had left her with, $11,400 in 1959, had grown by 1975 to $63,000. She had added to it every year. She had reduced it by exactly nothing. The rebuilt Oliver was still her primary tractor. It had logged more hours by 1975 than the original engine would have survived, and the Continental F244 had not been rebuilt again because Ruth maintained it with the precision her father had taught her, checking clearances on a schedule she kept in the back of the ledger, changing oil on a calendar she posted in the shop, treating the machine as though its longevity was a moral commitment rather than a mechanical preference. You know what happened in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. You know about the interest rates. You know about the land values that had climbed through the 1970s on borrowed optimism and then fell and kept falling and took the borrowed money with them. You know about the farms that went to auction, not liquidation sales where a farmer was retiring and his children were taking over, but the other kind, the kind where the bank held the paper and the farmer stood in the yard and watched strangers bid on his equipment. Grundy County lost 31 farms between 1981 and 1986. 31 operations that had been family farms in 1980 were something else by 1986. And the men who had farmed them had built their operations the way the decade had encouraged them to build, on borrowed capital, at loan rates that had seemed manageable at 8% and became catastrophic at 18%. Harold Bremer lost his farm in the spring of 1984. He had borrowed against his land value in 1977 to buy a new four-wheel drive tractor and a new planter and a set of field cultivators. And when the land value fell and the interest rate rose, the bank called the note, and Harold could not cover it. He sold the 1977 tractor at auction for less than half what he had paid for it, and it wasn't enough. Ruth watched this from the adjacent farm with the quiet sadness of someone who had seen the outcome coming for long enough that it had stopped being a surprise and had become simply a grief, not with satisfaction, never with satisfaction. Harold Bremer was a fair man who had worked hard his entire life and had made the same decision that 30 other farmers in Grundy County had made. And the decision had been wrong, and the wrongness had not been obvious when he made it. Ruth's expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. She had no equipment loans. She had no operating line beyond what she carried into each season from the previous year's margin. The rebuilt Oliver was paid for. The rebuilt Minneapolis Moline was paid for. The farm was paid for. The grain bins were paid for. When interest rates hit 18%, Ruth Hadley's interest expense was zero because she owed nothing to anyone, and the arithmetic of that was so simple and so devastating that it barely needed to be stated. By 1983, the savings account held $91,000. The Bremer farm went to auction in October of 1984. 320 acres of Grundy County ground, good heavy clay that Harold had farmed for 26 years, offered in 2 parcels. The opening bid on the larger parcel, 200 acres, came from a land investment company out of Des Moines that had been buying distressed farmland across central Iowa at prices that reflected the crisis rather than the land's actual productive capacity. Ruth Hadley stood at the back of the crowd in her work coat and her boots, and she waded through the bidding on the first parcel, which the investment company took at $840 an acre. Then the second parcel came up, 120 acres, the parcel that shared a fence line with her north field, the parcel she had farmed adjacent to for 22 years. The investment company opened at $750 an acre. A second bidder, a farmer from Butler County, came in at $800. The investment company went to $850. Ruth raised her hand at $900 an acre. The investment company went to $950. Ruth went to $1,000. The investment company paused, the kind of pause that meant someone was on a telephone or consulting a limit, and then dropped out. Ruth Hadley bought 120 acres of Grundy County farmland for $1,000 an acre. Total, $120,000. She paid with a cashier's check she had obtained from the Grundy County Bank that morning. The crowd went quiet, not politely quiet, not the quiet of people waiting for the next item, the quiet of a room where everyone has just recalculated something simultaneously, where an assumption that had been operating invisibly for 20 years has just become visible and been found wrong. The kind of quiet where you can hear the wind in the trees at the edge of the fairgrounds and the sound of someone's truck idling in the parking lot. A man named Gerald Siebert, who ran the feed store in Grundy Center and who had been one of the men in the church parking lot in 1962, who had discussed Ruth's $40 mistake with the certainty of collective common sense, walked over to where Ruth was signing the paperwork. He stood next to her for a moment, and then he said, "Vernon raised you right." Ruth looked up from the paperwork and said, "He did." Then she went back to signing. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Vernon Hadley would have understood without a word of explanation. Ruth Hadley farmed 360 acres through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s. The rebuilt Oliver was still in the equipment shed, still running, still used for field work that didn't require her larger tractors. It had been painted twice more since 1963, once in 1971 and once in 1979. And the Continental F244 had been rebuilt a second time in 1977 at a cost of $212 for parts, which Ruth had noted in the ledger alongside the original rebuild cost of $127, and the total cost of the engine over 15 years of primary use had been $339, which was less than the monthly payment on Harold Bremer's 1977 tractor had been. In 1991, Ruth's niece, Carol Pfeiffer, Dale's youngest daughter, who had spent enough time on Ruth's farm as a teenager that the farm had become a second home, came back to Grundy Center after 6 years away and told Ruth she wanted to learn the operation. Ruth said she had been waiting for her to ask. Carol was 27 years old. Ruth was 60. They spent the next 8 years farming together, and Ruth spent those years teaching Carol the way Vernon had taught Ruth, not by explaining, but by doing with Carol present, until the doing became Carol's own. Vernon's shop was still standing. The tools were still on the pegboard in their outlined spaces. The lathe that Vernon had bought in Waterloo in 1928 was still operational, still accurate, still capable of holding a tolerance that would have satisfied a production machinist. Ruth had maintained it the way she maintained everything, on a schedule with precision as a moral commitment. Carol learned the lathe in the winter of 1992. She was 15 years into her farming life before she fully understood what she had learned there, which is the way it usually works with things that matter. In 1997, the Grundy County Farm Bureau asked Ruth to speak at their annual meeting. She was 66 years old, and she had not sought this kind of attention at any point in the previous 35 years. She accepted because Carol told her she should, and because she thought there might be something worth saying to a room full of farmers who had survived the 1980s and were now in the relative prosperity of the late 1990s, beginning to borrow again. She spoke for 8 minutes. She did not use notes. She said that she had farmed 240 acres for 30 years and 360 acres for 13 years, and that in all of that time, she had never borrowed money for equipment or operating expenses, and that this had not been because she was afraid of debt, but because she had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had told her that the interest she would have paid over those years was larger than the value of any efficiency she would have gained from newer equipment. She said that she had rebuilt 4 tractors in her father's shop for a combined cost of less than $2,000, and that those 4 tractors had outlasted the loans on equipment that had cost her neighbors 10 times as much. She said that a paid-for tractor and a paid-for farm were the only things a bank could not take from you, and that everything else was just borrowing time. She said one more thing. She said that people had looked at her first tractor and seen junk, and she had looked at their payments and seen the same thing. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then it was not quiet. Gerald Siebert was in the room. He was 71 years old, and he had been running the feed store for 40 years, and he had heard a great many speeches at a great many Farm Bureau meetings. He told his wife on the drive home that it was the best 8 minutes he had ever heard at one of those meetings, and that he wished he had understood in 1962 what he understood now, which was that the woman who paid $40 for a rusted Oliver at the Grundy County Fairgrounds had not been making a mistake. She had been making a point. It had just taken him 35 years to be in a position to hear it. What do you see when you look at a rusted tractor with no hood and grass growing through the wheel spokes? Most people see the end of something, a machine that has been used up and left behind, worth less than the iron it's made from, a problem for whoever has to haul it away. Ruth Hadley looked at that Oliver in September of 1962 and saw a frame, a transmission, a rear axle, and a set of dimensions she had already measured against an engine she had already bought. And she saw $360 worth of work standing between her and a tractor that would outlast the loans on every piece of new equipment in the county. That's the difference between a buyer and a builder. $40. A farm liquidation sale outside of Grundy Center, Iowa. A 31-year-old woman with her father's tools and her father's arithmetic and a Continental F244 engine already sitting in the shop. The tractor nobody wanted. In the hands of the woman nobody understood, until the day she signed a cashier's check for $120,000. and the crowd went quiet, and the quiet said everything that needed to be said.